The Ivory Council chamber stood like an ancient sentinel on Seahorse Isle, a testament to generations of tradition and sacrifice. The walls, layered with fossilized bones, formed a haunting structure of interwoven ivory that gleamed faintly under the dull moonlight, filtering through narrow slits carved into the rock. The chamber's scent was thick with the brine of salt, mingling with the ancient musk of dried seaweed clinging to the base of the walls. It was a place where decisions of great weight were made, decisions that reverberated through the lives of every Probitian. At the center of this solemn hall, 4 figures stood, their massive frames wrapped in ceremonial robes that bore the insignia of their ancestral lineages. Their tusks, sharp and glistening in the faint light, jutted from their weathered faces that had seen more seasons of hardship and conflict than any mortal could count. Each breath the figures took was slow and deliberate, a rhythm that matched the steady beat of the sea beyond. Finally, Mar broke the silence. His voice, low and heavy with acceptance, seemed to reverberate through the bones of the chamber. "The Isles, they open now," he intoned, his words like a solemn prayer to an unchangeable fate. Mar's eyes, dim with years of vigilance, held a melancholic understanding that came only to those who had seen too many cycles of hope and despair. But there was no acceptance in Harshen's eyes. His gaze burned with intensity, sharp and unforgiving as he took a step forward. His voice was a booming force, crashing through the chamber like the breaking of a great wave. "We were warned of the melt," he barked, his tusks gleaming in the fractured light. "And what did you allow?" The tension in the room shifted, tightening like the moment before a storm unleashed its fury. Quentin, standing between Harshen and the others, took a steadying breath. He raised a flippered hand, his voice calm and measured, a practiced mediator. "Quiet, Harshen," he said firmly, yet not without compassion. "One cannot contend with the will of the elements." A silence followed, heavy and almost suffocating. It was a silence that held unspoken words, weighted by years of unresolved conflicts. Harshen's eyes narrowed, but he held his tongue, his tusks quivering slightly in restrained anger. "Let the elders speak," Quentin continued, turning with reverence towards the figure draped in the most elaborate of robes. Elder Pliny, the oldest and wisest of the council, slowly lifted his gaze. His eyes, though clouded with age, still held the remnants of a sharpness that once had commanded armies and brokered fragile peace. Now, Quentin, Harshen is right," Pliny said, his voice trembling slightly, but resolute. He took a slow, deliberate breath, allowing his words to sink in. Harshen's accusatory gaze softened slightly, his anger momentarily quelled by the recognition of his truth. "We were warned of this melt and the impending summons of the super ocean," Pliny continued, his voice carrying the weight of millennia of knowledge. The chamber seemed to grow colder as he spoke, as if the icy winds from the northern seas had seeped into the very bones of the room. "It was in the sigils etched into the bergs," Pliny recited, his words holding a cadence like a long-remembered song. "Our ancestors witnessed, passed down through generations." Mar's eyes widened slightly, while Quentin let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. Even Harshen lowered his head, a sign of respect for the ancient forewarnings. These were not mere legends. They were truths carved into the very land beneath their feet. "Times of great change are now," Pliny continued gravely. His voice seemed to echo through the chamber, bouncing off the walls as if the spirits of their ancestors themselves listened. "The islands will alter, some will flood, and new lands will form." He paused, a slight smile forming on his aged face, a glimmer of hope amid the weight of his words. "Seahorse Isle, our home, will become a haven." But Harshen's fists clenched at the word haven, his shoulders rippling with restrained anger. The others noticed, yet none spoke, each breath in the room held in anticipation. "Will it?" Harshen's voice was cold, dripping with skepticism. He took a step forward, his heavy form casting a long shadow that reached toward the other council members. "Why should we harbor those who migrate?" His voice rose, carrying a sharp edge. "Where were they when Probitia needed aid in the elemental waves of chaos that came from the unknown regions of the north?" The question hung in the air, waiting for an answer. Harshen stepped forward again, his movements measured and powerful, each step reverberating through the chamber like a war drum, his tusks caught in the faint moonlight giving him a fearsome appearance. There was no help, no defense when the ancient Hydro tore asunder the lands of our unified clans. He roared, his voice filled with fury and a deep, lingering hurt. Now chaos emerges again, great elder, and what will happen to our chiefdom? Will we allow our ancestors' work to fall into the great sea? His words struck like hammer blows, each one echoing with a sense of betrayal and loss. He stopped a few feet from the council's center, his presence imposing a force of nature unto himself. Harshen, Mar spoke again, his voice steady but firm. You hear the elder. We will become a haven. But Harshen's eyes, burning with betrayal, seemed to darken further. He turned to Pliny, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. Then you have lost the way of our clan, he spat, his tone laced with venom. Will you not see the truth, Pliny? I am the war chief. Are you not but a seer? The insult hung heavy in the air, the weight of it palpable. Pliny's face remained composed, yet his eyes showed the pain of Harshen's words. For a moment he said nothing, allowing Harshen's challenge to linger. Then, in a voice that was unwavering, despite its sadness, he responded, Harshen, leave this council. Your rage is uncontrollable. A brief silence followed, broken only by the distant roar of waves crashing against the rocks outside. Harshen's eyes narrowed further as he searched the faces of his fellow council members. His breath came heavy with resignation. The clan members, Harshen said, his voice defiant. They demand an answer. But Mar and Quentin remained silent, exchanging only a tense look. Pliny closed his eyes momentarily, as if in silent prayer, before opening them to meet Harshen's gaze. You, all of you. Harshen's voice shook, almost pleading, but beneath it was an edge of desperation. Harshen, Quentin said softly, his tone a quiet plea for understanding. See reason. Another silence settled over the chamber, deeper this time, almost suffocating. It felt as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for the coming storm. See reason? Harshen's voice twisted, filled with bitterness and grief. His eyes shone with a mixture of pain and anger. How is this for reason? With a swift movement, Harshen reached out behind him and drew his iron harpoon pike. The weapon, an extension of his wrath, gleamed wickedly in the low light. He moved with the practiced grace of a seasoned warrior, gliding forward in one smooth motion. There was no hesitation, no remorse, only grim purpose. 2 quick strikes were all it took. The first impaled Mar, the force of it pushing the elder back with a surprised gasp. Mar's body crumpled to the ivory floor, his eyes wide in shock. Quentin, frozen in place for a heartbeat too long, was next. The pike found its mark, and his body fell beside Mars, lifeless, like felled monuments that had stood for generations. The chamber was deathly silent. Harshen's breath was heavy, his chest heaving with the aftermath of his rage. He turned his gaze to Pliny, who stood motionless, his eyes meeting Harshen's with both defiance and sorrow. Do you not see, elder? Harshen's voice shook with emotion, though he struggled to control it. Now your kin are dead, as are you. Pliny's expression remained unchanged, a silent acceptance of what was to come. He held Harshen's gaze, refusing to look away. Now you stand as the final one to stand for Haven, Harshen said, his voice grim with finality. What say you? The heavy doors of the chamber creaked open. Probitian guards, their harpoons gleaming in the dim light, entered and aligned themselves with Harshen. They stood firm, their faces unreadable, yet their loyalty was clear. You have murdered the members of the Ivory Council. Pliny's voice was thick with pain and betrayal. And you stand as a traitor to Probitia. He took a deep, rattling breath, his old lungs struggling to keep pace with the tension of the moment. You must know your place. Pliny's eyes were resolute, though behind them lay a deep sadness. He knew the inevitability of what came next, yet he did not flinch. Harshen's expression softened, almost regretful. Then you stand in the way of the great ancestors, he said quietly. With a final swift movement, Harshan thrust his pike through the great elder's chest. The iron pierced Pliny's ceremonial robe, and a deep, guttural sound escaped the elder's lips as the life began to drain from him. For a moment, it seemed as if time itself stood still, the chamber frozen in the breath between heartbeats. Pliny's eyes, once so sharp and wise, grew distant, clouding over as he slumped against the pike. Harshan, still gripping the weapon, looked into Pliny's eyes as they dimmed. The elder's face, lined with years of wisdom and hardship, showed not fear, but a quiet acceptance, as if he had always known this moment would come. With one last shallow breath, Pliny's eyes closed, and his body fell limp, sliding from the pike to the cold ivory floor. For a moment, Harshan stood there, breathing heavily, his grip tightening and loosening on the pike as he tried to steady himself. The chamber was silent, save for the muffled roar of the sea outside and the faint echoes of Harshan's breathing. His guards remained motionless, waiting for his command. "Now I stand as the Ivory Elder," Harshan declared, his voice deep and echoing through the now eerily quiet chamber. There was no trace of triumph in his tone, only a heavy sense of finality. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. He turned to the guards, who watched him with unreadable expressions. Harshan's eyes were hard, his posture straightening as he assumed the mantle of leadership he had so violently seized. "The clan members will have their verdict," Harshan continued, his voice firm and unyielding. "Retrieve the prisoner. We will demonstrate our power. Call forth the herd's assembly." The guards bowed in unison and exited the chamber with purposeful strides, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. Harshan stood alone, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like the crushing depths of the sea. He looked down at the bodies of his former council members, their lifeless forms splayed on the floor like discarded relics of a bygone era. With a heavy sigh, Harshan turned and walked towards the massive doors, his gait deliberate and slow. The light filtering through the narrow slits seemed dimmer now, as if the very air had darkened with the deeds committed within the chamber's walls. As the scene shifted, the sounds of the roaring sea grew louder, merging with the distant chanting of assembled Probitians. The ancient amphitheater on Seahorse Isle stood like a sentinel against the stormy sea, its stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and salt. The amphitheater was a relic of the Probitian culture, a place where verdicts were passed and rituals performed. Tonight, it would bear witness to something far darker. The moon, full and ominous, hung in the sky like a watchful eye, casting its pale light over the churning waters. The amphitheater was illuminated by rows of red candles, arranged in pairs that flickered and danced in the wind. Their glow, a flickering blood red, contrasted sharply against the cold silver light of the moon, giving the entire scene an air of foreboding. Harshan stood on a small island at the center of the amphitheater, elevated above the horde of Probitians who surrounded him on all sides. The assembled masses, their forms cloaked in shadows, chanted rhythmically, their deep voices resonating through the air like the relentless crashing of waves. It was a primal sound, filled with anticipation and barely restrained sense of rage. "Probitia!" Harshan's voice, amplified by the amphitheater's acoustics, echoed above the thrumming of the sea. "Clan members of Seahorse Isle, the Elder is dead." Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by murmurs that quickly swelled into a wave of anger and confusion. The Probitians shifted restlessly, their chants momentarily faltering as they tried to process what they had just heard. Harshan raised his pike high, the weapon catching the moonlight as he continued. His voice hardened with conviction. "As are the other members of the Ivory Council. The verdict? Treason. From the one let in. From the one given haven." The crowd's chants resumed, growing louder and more frenzied with each passing moment. The waves crashed violently against the stone walls of the amphitheater, the wind whipping through the air with increasing intensity. The candlelight flickered wildly, caught in the mounting tension that permeated the amphitheater. "Bring the traitor forth," Harshan commanded, his voice unwavering. An iron gate at the far end of the amphitheater creaked open, its rusted hinges groaning in protest. A narrow land bridge extended from the gate, parting the churning horde like the opening of a great wound. 4 guards emerged, dragging a bound prisoner towards the central island. The prisoner was a black crow, its feathers dulled and matted, its wings bound in iron chains that rattled with each forced step. Despite the bindings, the crow held its head high, its dark eyes burning with defiance even in the face of its grim fate. Harshen's gaze locked onto the prisoner, his expression one of cold fury. "Brought to haven by the council," he began, his voice thick with righteous anger, "only to reveal his true character as an assassin." A hush fell over the crowd. The Probitians watched with bated breath. The sea seemed to still for a moment, as if nature itself held its breath in anticipation of what was to come. "No more," Harshen's voice rose, filled with a fervor that bordered on madness. "No more will Probritia stand for open waters." The guards surrounding the prisoner raised their harpoons, their tips gleaming in the moonlight. The crowd watched in silence, their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them. "We honor our ancestors," Harshen shouted, his voice echoing over the crashing waves. "An eye for an eye." The guards moved as one, their harpoons striking the crow's feathered body with brutal precision. The prisoner let out a strangled cry, its wings twitching in a futile attempt to escape. The crowd let out a collective cry, their voices merging with the roaring waves as the crow's lifeless body fell into the writhing mass below. For a moment, there was silence, a silence filled with the weight of ancient traditions and the echoes of a dark past. Then the crowd erupted into a deafening roar, their chants swelling to a fever pitch. "This is a day of renewed strength," Harshen declared triumphantly, his voice ringing with finality. "United, we will make Probitia great again." The Probitians continued their rhythmic chanting, their voices merging with the thunderous crash of the waves. Harshen, gripping his pike tightly, began to beat it against the ground in a steady rhythm. Each strike reverberated through the amphitheater like the beat of a war drum, causing the candles to flicker violently. One by one, the flames were extinguished, plunging the amphitheater into darkness. Only the pale glow of the moon remained, casting an eerie light over the scene. Harshen stood motionless on the central island, his eyes closed as he breathed heavily, absorbing the energy of the moment. Below him, the dark sea churned angrily, reflecting the turmoil and anticipation of the horde. In the moon's cold light, Harshen raised his pike high, the weapon's tip catching the silver glow. He let out a final, primal roar of victory, a sound that carried across the choppy waters and reverberated through the empty night. As the echo of his roar faded, the scene dissolved into darkness, leaving only the lingering memory of bloodshed, betrayal, and a fragile peace shattered by the relentless march of history.